The head of the British Armed Forces says that its civilian evacuations from Afghanistan will end today. But General Sir Nick Carter admits not everyone who's eligible to leave will actually be able to do so. He also confirmed that troops will then have to leave ahead of Tuesday's withdrawal deadline. Now, on Friday, Boris Johnson said he would shift heaven and earth to allow those who wish to leave the country to do so after the August 31st withdrawal deadline set by the Americans. Now, there have been calls by MPs for troops to continue to stay in Afghanistan past that August 31st deadline. So, should we maintain a military presence in Afghanistan? Joining me to discuss this now on The Clash tonight is Colonel Richard Kemp, former head of British forces in Afghanistan, Amalendu Misra as well, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University, and Rob Clark, Defence Policy Associate at the Henry Jackson Society, and indeed an Afghan war veteran. So it's an incredible smorgasbord of guests that we've got for you this evening. Thank you very much for making the time for us. Rob, I'm going to start with you, please, if that's OK. Do you think we should maintain a military presence in Afghanistan?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think we consider the status quo up until recently it was working. We had an incredibly light military footprint that was sustainable. And when we consider people say, well, 20 years was the right time to pull out based on an arbitrary time frame. If we consider, the British Army were in Germany for 65 years after World War II, 50 of those for nation building. It was an incredibly sustainable long-term deployment that didn't need to be ended so quickly, if at all. It's important to note that the British Army maintained more troops in Estonia than we did in Afghanistan until recently. And likewise with Washington, the Americans had more troops in Washington, D.C. than they did in Afghanistan. So it wasn't a particularly arduous and high-risk military operation, for the last 4 or 5 years. We've just seen now, with the announcement of the withdrawal of the American troops and the British troops, we've now had the most deadly day for American service personnel in 10 years. Yeah. So I think it's nonsensical, really, how absolutely we should have maintained a small, limited, but long-term military footprint in Afghanistan. OK,
Amalendu Misra, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University. Do you agree?
My answer to that would be an unequivocal no. Because we have seen that nation building doesn't necessarily going to be the result that we're expecting in the last 20 years. So if we maintain another military presence there, or the footprint that we've been talking about, we'll be just sitting ducks. We have lost nearly 500 troops for nothing. Now we are talking about bringing back the civilians. Now the question is that can Afghanistan turn itself around? The answer to that is no. Because we have seen it that some societies are so warlike that they are not necessarily prepared to walk the modern path. And that is the reason why places such as North Caucasus, Somalia, and Afghanistan is a very good example here. So we simply cannot do anything there. If we had done something, then we would not be having all these Afghans who had helped the British troops and the British contingent in the last 20 years shouldn't be leaving the country. So my answer to that would be no. Afghanistan is
all right.
jumped.
Well, let's hear from Colonel Richard Kemp, former head of British forces in Afghanistan. Would you be maintaining a military presence over there now?
Well, I agree with Rob Clark's comments, and I don't really have anything to add to that in terms of the reason why we should stay. I think he articulated that very well. Incidentally, I should point out he and I served in the same regiment, but in terms of the British situation, rather than the global reason to remain in Afghanistan, I think it was impossible for Great Britain to remain there once the United States withdrew, and that goes for other NATO members. It wasn't really our decision; it was an American decision, and there are a number of reasons for that. There are predominantly two. One is that I don't believe there was a political will to stay. I think whatever some of our government ministers say, I think they were quite happy and actually very pleased with President Biden's decision. That doesn't make them look good now, and therefore they, are quite keen to deflect that decision to the Americans. But they've long wanted to get out of it and are happy with it, despite the fact the Defence Secretary says that he called a number of other NATO members to see if they'd like to form a NATO coalition led by the British in Afghanistan. Once the Americans pulled out, the answer to each of those phone calls was no, a resounding no. And I think that brings the second point, which is NATO is now exposed itself as a paper tiger. NATO is not able to operate anywhere in the world with any significance without the US. Therefore, effectively, the US equals NATO, and the other countries in NATO, including the UK, are just window dressing. Why is that? In the case of some countries, they simply don't want to fight. They don't want to pay their way, and they don't want to pull their weight.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk a bit about that. And Rob, I'm going to come back over to you now. Now, I made the point earlier on, and I stand by it, which is that I'm not convinced that the people of rural Afghanistan were clamouring for a Liberal Democrat-run society, to be perfectly honest with you. And whether or not we were even right to go in there and try to instil Western liberal values is indeed another question. But now that we've pulled out, you, as a veteran yourself, do you feel like all our efforts were completely in vain now? Do you feel like the loss of life was just a pointless exercise?
No, absolutely not. When we consider that the situation in Afghanistan has remained relatively stable for international security for the last 20 years, we've not seen a successful terrorist attack plotted, conceived or launched from Afghanistan since 9/11. Would that have been the same if we hadn't gone in the wake of 9/11?
Is that going to happen now? Is that going to happen now, do you think?
This is the problem. This is the problem. We're in a situation now where the West, under President Biden, have just allowed the Taliban to come back to power, not through the ballot, but through force, coercion, bribery and violence. Now, we're in that situation. Now, what the Taliban have done in the first 2 weeks of power, they've actually installed international terrorists from the Haqqani network to run the security situation in Kabul and the Nangarhar province as well, which is critical to it's on the Kabul-Pakistan highway. So we're in a situation now where we've got an Islamic State offshoot, Islamic State in the Khorasan province, who are now able to launch successful attacks against British, American and Western targets, as well as obviously Afghan targets in Kabul. Now, it doesn't take a stretch too far to imagine that Islamic State in the Khorasan province allowed continued access to territory and recruitment and funds in Afghanistan under the Taliban's now control, and I use control loosely, that they will be able to plan attacks here in the West as well. Now, this wasn't the case up until only a few weeks ago, when we still maintained a limited, light military footprint in Afghanistan for the last 6 or 7 years since the end of combat operations. It's incredibly important here to notice the distinction between the end of combat operations from the British in 2014-2015 and the last 6 or 7 years, which has enabled security in the capital, force protection, and the diplomatic and humanitarian efforts to actually flourish. What we've seen in Kabul in the last 7 years is a civil society in Afghanistan, the likes of which are not being seen since before the Soviet invasion in the late 1970s.
All right. Amalendu, there's an issue taking place at the moment. I believe whilst I'm on air now, we are currently loading something like 140 dogs and 60 cats into the back of an aeroplane, while simultaneously leaving behind several Afghan interpreters and, frankly, human beings. Now, is that going to be an issue in terms of international relations? Is that going to be an issue when it comes to our ongoing relationship with the people of Afghanistan? In short, will they just turn against us now?
Not necessarily. We're talking about 40 million Afghan population. So out of that, we might have won over only a fraction, maybe 500,000 or so. So the rest of them are diehard radicals, let's put it that way. It is not that everyone is a supporter of whatever was being undertaken by the West. So on the question of maintenance of troops, why should we be the sitting ducks? What is the guarantee that they're going to treat us well? We have seen these body bags coming home. Why should someone's son or someone's father be brought back in bags? So that is not an argument. We have tried, and we can, with smart warfare, just like the way President Biden ordered and whoever has been taken off in terms of the attack against the Islamic State of Khorasan. So we can do that. We don't necessarily have to have the physical footprint there in Afghanistan. So we might have changed the civil society, but that is only a very minuscule one in Kabul and some, urban areas. But the rural Afghanistan remains the same as it was 20 years back. So when you talk about making the changes, it is not going to happen. I mean, pessimist here in terms of how things can happen.
All right, Colonel Richard Kemp, throwing over to you now. Should Boris Johnson have done more? I've got a lot of emails in, by the way, on this. Thank you, everyone who is emailing in. gbviews@gbnews.uk. Some people making the point that actually once the US, once NATO went out, once America went out, how could we possibly have been expected to have stayed there on our own? I just wonder if that's something that you wish Boris Johnson had tried to get around a bit. Did he try and drum up any support from other nations to help kind of build another military coalition there, build some kind of force, or do you think he just wanted out as well?
Well, I think you just wanted out. The Defence Secretary claims that he asked non-NATO members to, non-American NATO members to join us in a UK-led coalition. But I don't. Well, whether he did or whether he didn't, I know the answer to that question would have been no, and it's because NATO doesn't really have the will to fight. The British Armed Forces have been decimated over the last several decades by successive governments, Conservative and Labour and coalition, to the extent that we despite the military skill and the military willingness, I would say, to do so and ability to do so, we don't seem to have the military capability today even to defend a small airport in Kabul to get people that we want to get out of the country. Now, that is absolutely shocking. And I sometimes wonder why we spend all the money we do on defence if we can't do what is a relatively straightforward task of that nature. And I'm not, in saying that, I'm not underestimating the danger or the complexities of that task. And I would like to take the opportunity now to pay tribute to all of our fighting men and women who have been out there, RAF and Army, who have been out there doing extremely a good job in very, very difficult circumstances, facing personal danger themselves. But no, and the answer is no NATO country except America any longer has the ability to conduct a mission and complete a mission of this sort. Hence, we all have to run when America runs.
Okay,
and incidentally, we've left those people we've left behind. These aren't just individuals who can now go about their work. These are now potentially going to get killed, and also they are hostages because the Taliban, if there's to be a negotiation about getting them out, they will extract a very high price for doing so.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.